Hello and welcome to another video which I guarantee is going to get you the top grades. I'm actually really excited about making this one today because I've looked at all my PowerPoint slides and I guarantee there's at least 20 ideas here that will get you into grades 8 and 9, most of which you probably haven't considered in class. I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about what it's going to look like visually. I hope this is something that's going to engage you in your learning. And because there are 30 slides, this is going to be like a lesson. But again, this lesson will teach you more than you would learn in 4 weeks studying this in school. And that's because everything I'm giving you here for free, of course, comes from my Guide to an Inspector Calls. So as you know, this play is performed first in 1945, and Priestley is dealing with a literary audience, an audience which reads. And consequently, he's using their reading to help sell the play's message. So how does Priestley use the whodunit genre, that detective one, to make us think like detectives? Well, for the first 2 acts, we can be confident that we're in the plot of a mystery like Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, which was written in 1934 and was a massive bestseller. Now, the crucial thing about Murder on the Orient Express, and this is a spoiler alert if you're going to read it, is that the victim is killed by everyone, and Hercule Poirot, the detective, works that out at the end. Well, this is exactly the plot that he has stolen from for an Inspector Calls. Everyone is responsible for the death of Eva. So in your exam writing, that's what you're going to say is his reason for this literary illusion, because it helps him drum home that message. We are all responsible, and they are all responsible for the death of Eva. Right, here is a literary illusion that you probably have studied, the idea of the morality play. So if we go back to medieval times, before Shakespeare, plays weren't just an entertainment, they were there to teach moral lessons from the Bible, and the characters were moved around like pieces on a chessboard. They weren't real people, they represented something else. So you might have a character who represented envy, the desire to have an item or experience that someone else possesses. And in a minute we'll look at how the characters in the play represent these 7 deadly sins who were stock characters in the morality play. We had gluttony, well that could be Mr. Burling, we'll skip over that one. Greed or avarice, that's another word for greed, an excessive pursuit of material possessions. You'll easily see how that links to capitalism in the play. Lust, an uncontrollable passion or longing, especially for sexual desires, and you can easily see how that fits Gerald and Eric. Pride, well that could fit so many of the characters. An excessive view of one's self without regard to others. Sloth, or if you like, laziness, excessive laziness, or the failure to act and utilise one's talents. Perhaps Eric might fall under that description. And wrath, which is an uncontrollable feeling of anger and hate towards another person. And although this isn't much talked about, I'd like to argue that actually Eva represents wrath. And when we get on to the section on Eva and her suicide, you'll see what I mean. So here we are. This is how they attach to each character. Arthur Burling, greed and avarice. Sheila is definitely envy. Remember how she's envious of how Eva looked with the dress held against her. Gerald is lust and also capitalist greed and avarice. Eric, perhaps gluttony because of his alcoholism and again his lust and possibly his sloth, which I talked about earlier. Sybil Burling is the most obvious one to connect with pride. Now comes the grade 7 and above point that you possibly haven't considered in class. Characters who represent the most number of deadly sins, i.e. having more than one, are therefore the most guilty in Priestley's presentation. He is most concerned, as we can see from that list, about the sexual exploitation of women, and that's represented by Gerald's and Eric's exploitation of Eva. So what I'm suggesting here is that these 2 male characters are far more responsible for Eva's tragedy than the others. And we're going to make links later with the Patriarchal Society and Priestley's attack on the male abuse of power. Okay, the next literary context is, of course, the Christian one, and the allusion to the Bible and also the Christian service. So morality plays are strongly rooted in the Christian tradition. That's why they were made. And it's Christian moral values which they taught. Priestley also uses this Christian language, and he deliberately uses words from the Anglican service because this is language which everyone in his audience would be familiar with, and 80% of his audience would have gone to church. So when the inspector teaches his final lesson that we are all members of one body, Priestley is deliberately making a biblical reference to two books from the Bible. One book's Romans and the other's Corinthians. Here's the quotation from Romans. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and everyone members one of another. And you can see that's exactly the inspector's message. So Priestley picks that Christian teaching to put at the centre of his play. In Corinthians, it looks like this. For we, being many, are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. And this is the Eucharist, the Mass, where you drink the wine, which symbolises Jesus' blood, and you eat the host, the bread, which symbolises his body. And so the reason for that is down here. If his audience are already Christian, and as I've shown you, 80% of them were, it's a very small step for them to embrace his socialist message if the socialist message comes in the same language as the Bible. In other words, Priestley is saying to his whole audience, look, if you're really Christian, then you have to be a socialist. Being a Christian is not compatible with the kind of capitalism I'm going to show you in the play. Now, the other thing about the church is it's also a performance, and it's a performance in which the audience joins in. So this idea of us all being one body is actually in the Eucharist, the Mass. So it's called the breaking of the bread. The president, the priest, breaks the consecrated bread, and he says, we break this bread to share in the body of Christ. And then everybody in the church, the whole congregations, replies, though we are many, we are one body, because we all share in one bread. So the grade 8 and 9 point here is that the Eucharist is a communal experience. And Priestley is also saying that the theatre is a communal experience, and therefore we share in this as a community. And as you can see, he uses that same language to drum home the Christian message for that community, which is the same as his socialist message. Okay, well, let's have another grade 8 allusion here. So Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and the whole story of Genesis and Adam and Eve and the serpent, which you're probably familiar with, is all a story about free will. So what happens in Genesis is that the serpent says to Eve, look, you can eat of the fruit of the tree that God has forbidden you to eat from, this tree of knowledge of good and evil, because when you do, you will know what God knows and you will be like God. And so Eve is tempted by this, she eats the fruit, and she suddenly understands good and evil. It changes the way she thinks about life, and actually she thinks this is marvellous and wants it to share it with Adam out of love. Now, Adam has this opportunity to say no, but interestingly, because he doesn't know about good and evil, he finds it really difficult to say no, but he's tempted. God has commanded him not to eat of the fruit, but he uses his free will to do so. So if you like, Genesis is a great experiment. God creates these perfect people, and then he gives them the choice between being good or going against his teaching. Well, that's exactly what the inspector does. So the inspector, with his supernatural kind of understanding and influence, takes the place of God in this analogy, and he says to the Burlings and Gerald, I'm giving you the free will to accept your responsibility for what you've done to Eva, or the free will to deny your responsibility. And just like Adam and Eve fail to follow God's teaching, so most of the characters fail to follow the inspector's teaching. But this gives us a structural point as to why the inspector leaves the play during Act 3 and doesn't remain to the end. And it's because Priestley is setting up the same kind of experiment that God set up in Genesis, very deliberately. And because his audience is 80% Christian, he expects many of them to make this association. Now, I wonder how many of you have spotted the literary allusion to time and the future and A Christmas Carol. So Priestley was obsessed with the idea of time. He was fascinated by the idea of time repeating itself. And he takes the plot of A Christmas Carol and shows us that this is relevant by creating the ghostly Inspector Goole. And A Christmas Carol, as you probably know, involves 3 ghosts who come to Scrooge. Well, actually 4, because this is Jacob Marley, sorry. So 4 ghosts who come to Scrooge to teach him a moral lesson. Now, the inspector is closest to the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, the one who sees into the future. Now, Christmas Carol is a didactic text. That means it is teaching a lesson. Steal that word for your essay. And it's also a morality tale, so you can see how it links to the morality play. Here, the job of the ghost is to teach the protagonist, who is Scrooge, the consequences of his behaviour, and that's just like Goole. And his job is to teach each character the effects of their actions from the past, just like in A Christmas Carol, and they also teach the future. So the future can be changed. So crucially, Scrooge has to change the future by changing his behaviour. And that's exactly the message from the inspector. If you change your behaviour, you will change the future. But if you don't change your behaviour, the future will not change. And that's why we get the second death. So we can clearly see Inspector Goole is a very close parallel to the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Now, his audience would clearly see that. That would be an obvious comparison to them, because probably 95% of his audience would have read A Christmas Carol, whereas most of you have just seen a film. But, this would be a novel which everybody knew intimately. Now, Priestley emphasises this by using the same dramatic device as Dickens. Scrooge is given a glimpse of a tragic future, just like the Burlings are. He sees a future for Bob and his family, just as the Burlings are giving a tragic future for Eva and her baby. And these are both families who are working class and poor. So he's making an exact social comparison about the role of the rich, represented by Scrooge and the Burlings, and the role of the poor, represented by Eva and her baby. Now, another literary allusion is the idea of the play as a tragedy. Now, tragedy isn't just a word we use to describe a play. It actually is a genre of play that has rules. So the Greeks invented tragedy as a form of theatre, and Aristotle's Poetics gave us the 3 unities, 3 unifying ideas that tragedies had to have. So they had the unity of action, which meant a play should have one unified plot and no subplot. Shakespeare's play, for example, all his plays have a subplot of some sort. All the action should occur within one day, which was the unity of time, and you can see how on stage actually the play happens in real time. And it's limited to a single place, the unity of place, which in this play is the dining room. When everybody leaves the dining room, we don't see them anymore until they come back. So the events in this play are symbolic. They are symbolic of wider tragedies. So Eva's death is a tragedy, not just because she dies, but because she represents the tragedies of the First and Second World Wars. The first death represents the First World War, the second death represents the Second World War, as you'll discover later. And obviously, the tragedy of Eva's death is that she symbolises the millions of Eva Smiths and the millions of John Smiths who are being exploited by capitalism. Now, other ways that Priestley signposts that this is a tragedy isn't just with the death, but with the hamartia of the main characters. The hamartia is the Greek word that is given to the characters' fatal flaw, the flaw that leads them towards the tragic events. And of course we link that hamartia to the 7 deadly sins. There they are in yellow. That is the hamartia of each character. Their fatal flaws that lead to the tragedy of Eva, but also the wider tragedies of what happens to the working classes and what happens to the country twice by entering a world war 2 times. So hopefully you're getting an idea how all these themes are connected, and when you start connecting them, you move beyond grade 7 into grade 8. And the final thing in here is this introduction of the Titanic. Most people study this just as a way to show that Priestley portrays Burling as a bit of an idiot, but actually it's much deeper than that, pardon the pun, because of the sinking of the Titanic. But the deepness there is, this is a huge tragedy in the public consciousness, and this is another way that Priestley signals that the events of his play are going to be a tragedy. Okay, you're probably very familiar with the theme of capitalism in the play, but I'm going to take you a little deeper into what it means. So in a capitalist system, businesses make money for the people who own them. In 1912 and even in 1945, these businesses were often owned by single families, which meant that most of the country's wealth was owned by a very small percentage of people. So you can see how these are represented by the Burlings and the Crofts, 2 families that represent a much wider business and ruling class. And the thing here is to remember that these are constructs. These characters are constructs created to represent the wider ruling class and the wider business community. Now, in a capitalist system, business owners are also shareholders. So in a capitalist society, the rich buy shares in business or a corporation, and when that business makes a profit, this money is paid out to the shareholders and is called a dividend. So you can see, not only do you make money because the value of your shares go up, you also make money because the business pays you part of its profits as a dividend. So you can see, if you've got money, it's really easy to earn more money for no work and therefore maintain your position as a rich person without doing anything to deserve it. All you've done is invest in other businesses. The more shares you own, the more money you will receive through a dividend. So you can see in most capitalist economies, the rich get richer as their capital, what they own in terms of money, earns more and more money through investment. In this way, the rich also tend to own the most land because that's what they buy with their money, and this also generates more profit through farming or building or rent. Now here's the kicker. The rich also pay less tax on dividends. So when you get these profits in dividends, you don't pay that much tax on it compared to what wage earners pay in tax. Yeah, so the government takes a lot more tax from workers than they do from the rich people's investments. So again, the rich get richer. So the important grade 8 point here is that in a capitalist society, it's not just that people don't have equal amounts of money. It's that once you're born with the advantage of money, that advantage gets greater. And if you are born with the disadvantage of not having money, that disadvantage gets greater. In other words, the gap between rich and poor grows bigger and bigger. And you can clearly link that to what happens with Eva, who gets poorer and poorer as the Burlings and the Crofts make more and more money. Okay, let's see if I can give you some grade 7 and 8 points about socialism. So in the socialist system, the government owns as much of big business as possible. For example, transport, railways, car manufacturing, house and road building, gas, electricity, phones, coal, steel, and more. Now, the profits from these businesses go directly to the government, and then the government makes sure that workers are paid fair wages, and they use all these profits to spend on welfare. Well, what sort of thing does the government spend these profits on? Health, education, welfare for people who are unemployed, and that welfare is free, and therefore poverty is reduced. Essentials like water, electricity, gas, and the telephones, trains and buses are also owned by the government so that prices are kept low. You're not charged loads by businesses trying to make a profit out of you. So everyone has a better quality of life, even if there aren't so many rich people. Profits are also spent on social welfare, so everyone is looked after. It makes for a fairer society because the poor are less poor and the rich are less rich. So hopefully you can see how the plot of the play promotes socialism and how it will show that capitalism actually makes the lives of ordinary people much worse, not just Eva's life, but millions of people. Now, of course, people going to the theatre are usually quite well off, and the chances are that a huge number of the people sitting in his audience in 1945 are themselves businessmen or rich, and they are probably capitalists. You know, they believe that the capitalist system is the fairest one. Now, the main reason that they would say the capitalist system is the fairest one is that everybody in the business wants to make a profit. Therefore, they get very efficient, they keep their costs down, and they try and make products which people want to buy or offer services that people want to buy, because that's the way to make profits. So it makes for a really efficient system. They would argue that in the socialist system, although it sounds fair, it becomes really inefficient, because if you're working for one of these businesses owned by the government, there's no reason for you to be particularly brilliant at your job because the government's still going to pay you. And there's no reason for you to make the rail system super efficient or the electricity system super efficient, because you get paid the same no matter how efficient it is. So in the socialist system, they argue there's no incentive for people to actually make their businesses really efficient or to provide really brilliant services or to make really brilliant products. Well, however you feel about it politically, Priestley sees himself as a teacher. And his father was a teacher, and therefore he makes the inspector a teacher. The inspector is therefore a proxy for Priestley's teaching. And the things he wants to teach us about are the perils, the dangers of capitalism, the benefits of socialism, and the Christian morality of being a socialist, and the immorality of being a capitalist. So as you know, Priestley's father was a teacher. The inspector wants to teach the Burlings that we were all responsible for everything that happened to everyone. The inspector is here to teach, not just to discover what has occurred. This is why when Burling objects, saying, "How I choose to run my business is not relevant," the inspector replies, "It might be," revealing that this is a political play looking at the morality of business. So this quotation is really going to help you argue that it's not just a murder mystery. It's a really, at root, a political play with a political message. Now he examines the exploitation in business through the wages Eva and her colleagues are paid, defending their right to strike. After all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. So this metaphor implies that capitalism is in effect a form of theft. It is stealing not just from each other, but if you like, from nature itself. It's stealing from the earth. And in this way, he tries to show that capitalism is unnatural, whereas socialism and proper morality are natural things we should pursue. Okay, I now want you to think about the role of Edna in representing the oppressed but deserving working class. You might even have forgotten who Edna was. So she is the maid who we see dishing out the drinks, clearing away the food at the beginning of the play. And she also, crucially, introduces the inspector. These are her words. He says it's important. Now, this can be performed in a resigned way. This would imply she's so used to a life of subservience as a domestic servant that she's not able to appreciate the inspector standing up for the rights of the working classes, which are also her rights. So we could play Edna to show that the working classes don't believe they can stand up for themselves because they've been so oppressed, they've just come to believe this idea that they deserve to be poor. Alternatively, it can be performed in the opposite way, as a warning to the Burlings to listen to what he, the inspector, has to say. Okay, so we could read it as because he says it's important, and therefore emphasizing he shows us that the inspector is the voice of authority. Whichever interpretation you choose, it isn't a coincidence that Priestley decides that Edna should announce his presence, because this allies him symbolically to the working class right at the beginning of the play. And also, although I haven't included that on this slide, she gives us the title of the play. She says, "An inspector's called," and therefore that gives us the title. So although she has a really small part, her part is crucial in showing how the inspector is linked entirely to this idea of working class aspiration and giving them their rights. There again, a grade 8 point which you probably have not considered before. Well, I'm pretty confident that you've probably not considered this point, so this will be another grade 8 one, and it's the idea of capitalism as theft, which we looked at a moment ago with the quotation about asking for the earth and taking it. So let's consider the £50 that Eric has stolen from his father's business to give to Eva. Now, what you probably don't know is that £50 is nearly a year's salary. It's actually 40 weeks of an average salary. If we think of it in terms of Eva's salary when she was at the Burlings. So it's 40 weeks worth of what she was earning at the Burlings. Now, Eric can't possibly have been given her all that money in the few months they're together. They're only together for about 4 months. And we know that's true because she feels the need to go to Mrs. Burling's charity to get help because she's got no money left, and then commit suicide afterwards. So what's going on? How has Eric stolen so much, but Eva is still so poor? So this is the kind of detail which would trouble a contemporary audience after the play. They might not think of it at the time, but after they'd left, they'd think, hang on, Eric stole £50? Well, that's a huge amount of money. How did Eva run out? So they'd notice the sums didn't add up, which is very difficult for us to do. I'm pretty sure that you probably haven't considered that. So if it's obvious to the audience, it must be obvious to the inspector. So why doesn't the inspector accuse Eric of lying about giving this money to Eva? So probably because he wants his audience to think hard and draw conclusions for themselves, because that's part of the genre of a whodunit after all. So he's tapping into this idea of solving a mystery, which the play is, and he's adding in a new mystery. So Priestley's cunning is to set this up so that the audience leave knowing not just who is responsible for Eva's death, but who is responsible for the 2 world wars. In other words, when he thinks about it as a whodunit, he's going to think about the second death, and he's thinking, well, why did that second death happen? And he wants us to link that to the idea of a capitalist patriarchy, which I'll teach you about later in the video. And this is why the inspector accuses Eric of the theft. You stole money. But Eric refuses to accept his responsibility. He says, not really, because he was going to pay it back. So this symbolizes how the capitalists are criminals. A, by stealing the money. B, by denying that it's actually theft. But C, he's stolen it partly for himself. He must have kept loads of that money for himself in order for Eva to have spent her part and need Mrs. Burling's charity. So the capitalist Eric actually lies to us all, and possibly to himself. He thinks that he's acting nobly, giving this money to Eva, but actually he must be taking quite a bit of it for himself and then denying that's what he's done. Now, this is really important when we consider the younger generation and the idea that Eric and Sheila have learnt their lesson. Because when we start looking at Eric here, we can quite clearly see that Eric has not fully learnt this lesson. He has not taken full responsibility, and he will deceive himself again by returning to his capitalist ways, which is why the second death of Eva will still occur. Right, let's now consider the Patriarchal Society, the feminist message of the play. And I want to suggest to you another grade 7 and above idea here, that this is actually a feminist play. All right, Priestley is a man, but he's got a strong feminist message, as I'll teach you. So you probably know that in 1912, women didn't have a vote. Many of them went to the streets and demonstrations to protest about this. They formed a group called the Suffragettes because suffrage was the name given to having a vote, and they feminized it by turning it with ets, suffragettes, because they were campaigning for the equal right to vote as men. And I'm going to argue really strongly, I hope, that Priestley also believed in women having equal rights. And that's why the inspector deliberately focuses on these young women, and it's why Priestley hasn't chosen any kind of industry which involves men. So he could have chosen a coal mining industry or steelworks, which would have been completely dominated by men, and he could have focused on the John Smiths, the millions of them that he talks about later, but he doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is he's actually talking about a feminist message, and he wants to point out that male power in a patriarchal society dehumanizes men and damages women. So he also wants to say that women are far more vulnerable to capitalist exploitation than men. All the women in Priestley's audience can now vote in 1945, they've got the right, whereas in 1912, which wouldn't have seemed long ago to the audience of 1945, none of them had this right. So he's pointing out to the women, so much has changed since your mothers were born. So much has changed since 1912. Now, at the end of my play, I want you also to vote for social change and vote for a Labour government, because the timing of this play in 1945 is just before the election, and it is a political play designed to make people vote Labour. The inspector therefore teaches his feminist viewpoint. He says we should put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies. He points out how little women are paid, and he points out that we have to empathise with them. We have to put ourselves in their place. It is a feminist play. If you think about where he describes the women living, he talks about them living at the back of the guest houses. In other words, they get the worst rooms because they earn the least money. Therefore, the male lodgers will be in the better rooms because they earn more. So the women are literally at the back of the house, but also symbolically at the back. And it symbolises how they are inferior and marginalised in a patriarchal society. So why else does Priestley focus on women? Well, because they will be, I've written here, half of his audience. Actually, that's probably not true, because there are still millions of men still fighting overseas. So actually, his audience at the time when it was first performed would have included many more women than men. And what's significant is millions of these women have been in jobs only made possible by war. So they will have swarmed into the factories because the men who used to work in the factories have obviously been conscripted as soldiers. So this was a massive opportunity for women. Now, in the First World War, the same thing happened. All these women took up loads of jobs. They suddenly became independent, had money of their own. And what happened? Well, after the First World War, the men came back and the women were forced out of their jobs. But in a socialist economy, that would not happen. women's jobs would not suddenly be unavailable. And therefore, Priestley's socialist message has a real interest to women, because they know what happened to their mothers and how their mothers suddenly lost their independence. And you can believe that they would have been really keen to have a full part to play, an employed part, in 1945. So this helps with his socialist message, and it helps with winning the election, because the key voters are going to be women. Now, the other way that Priestley attacks the Patriarchal Society is in how the Burlings deal with their daughter Sheila, and they treat her as property. So Burling expects Sheila to accept Gerald's affair with Daisy Renton. Now, just imagine that for an audience nowadays, where a father would expect his daughter just to marry her fiancé, even though the fiancé has just confessed that he's been cheating on her all along. Extraordinary. But because this is a patriarchal society, where Burling is actually much more interested in forming an alliance with Crofts, so Sheila's marriage to Burling isn't about love as far as Burling's concerned, it's about making a much stronger business. He's also uncritical when Gerald mentions women of the town. This is a euphemism for prostitutes, but Burling simply expects that because Gerald is an upper-class man, he'll be paying for sex with these prostitutes. He just assumes that's entirely normal and entirely acceptable. And it's Priestley's way of showing that obviously Burling did this in his youth, and that's what upper-class men are expecting to do. So far from being critical of this, he still expects Sheila to marry Gerald. Not only is he having affairs, he's paying for prostitutes, and Burling simply doesn't see a problem with that. Well, that is a patriarchal view. We can clearly see that he's exploiting his own daughter's happiness in the same way that he's exploiting women by paying for sex, and exploiting women by having affairs and then abandoning them. So in a patriarchal society, when men get too much power, the thing they do with it is destroy women's lives. Burling also believes that removing her while Gerald confesses to his affair and use of prostitutes is psychologically easier for her. He thinks he's being kind to her, just not letting her listen to the details. So yes, you're going to have to put up with it, he says, but if you don't know the sordid details, it won't really hurt you. We can also see this double standard when Sheila mentions how Alderman Meggerty, another upper-class man, sexually assaulted a girl she knows. And Sheila points out she only escaped with a torn blouse. Now, the use of the word only there shows how common it must be for a much more serious sexual assault to be made. Well, Burling isn't shocked at this behaviour from Alderman Meggerty. No, he's shocked by Sheila mentioning it. Sheila, he says, with an exclamation mark. So he will defend the right of upper-class men to sexually assault women rather than protect their rights, even when it comes to his daughter. Now, even when Burling does hear Gerald confess to his affair with Daisy, this is what he says. Now, Sheila, I'm not defending him, but you must understand that a lot of young men, in other words, even the rights of his own daughter, are secondary to what he perceives as the right of young men to have sex as often as they please with whoever they want, even if it is a sexual assault or an exploitation, as we will see, of Daisy Renton. Now, this is a really angry attack on the upper classes. It's not just about the inequality of wealth. It is about the total abuse of power that happens when you give men in society complete control of wealth and political power. Okay, well, another grade 7 to 8 idea that you may not fully have considered is that the play isn't just an attack on capitalism. It is making a strong link between capitalism and war. So let's have a look at how capitalism creates a patriarchy which creates war. Let's look at the inspector's last words. Because he realises that Britain is still a patriarchal society in 1945, though less than it was in 1912, and because women in 1945 can now vote, he warns, if men, not mankind, or not man, which means everybody, but if men will not learn that lesson. Now this again shows us how it's a feminist play attacking the patriarchy because of what men are going to do. But what men are going to do is this: they're going to lead us into 2 world wars, which they will then be taught a lesson in fire and blood and anguish. So here, Priestley is pointing out that giving all these powers to men in this capitalist society inevitably leads to war. Now, because the inspector is speaking in 1912, before the First World War, this is a way that Priestley helps us understand that his powers are supernatural. He's foreseen the wars that the audience have lived through. So it's another way in which he hints at that supernatural presence, and that links us back to the idea of A Christmas Carol, and will link us to the idea of the inspector being a proxy for God's judgment. Now, Priestley also shows capitalism as exploitation of workers. We get a sense of his anger again. Gerald tells the inspector, "We're respectable citizens and not criminals." But notice this isn't the same as saying that they're not immoral and that they don't exploit workers. All he's saying is that that immorality and exploitation is not illegal. But Priestley believes it should be. Not paying workers enough to live on is morally the same as paying them enough and then stealing from their wages. And that's what he wants to show capitalists do. They effectively steal from the people who work for them. Consequently, the inspector says, I wouldn't know where to draw the line, and he means between respectable citizens and criminals. This is as close as he gets to saying that the capitalist system is actually criminal, which links us directly back to Eric, and it links us back to the idea of a cartel where businesses get together to pay workers the same wages. So the Crofts and Burlings pay the same low wages to the workers in their business, which means they can't move on to get a better job. There are no better jobs, and therefore the employers artificially keep the wages low, and that is also a criminal activity. Now, Gerald's reaction to this is significant. He doesn't disagree with the inspector. He simply points out this: fortunately, it isn't left to you, is it? Now, the use of the word fortunately here reveals that he knows he's lucky to get away with it. And is it at the end also implies that Gerald believes he and other capitalists can keep getting away with it. And the tragedy of the play is that between 1912 and 1945, he's correct. And it's something that Priestley is desperate to stop. He doesn't want the capitalists to keep getting away with it. Now, another point you might not have considered is that Priestley is showing how the capitalists actually need war. In order to make greater profits, they need war. So they're willing to sacrifice the lives of their own sons, perhaps like Eric, for example, in order to get greater profits. Let's see how he does this. So he discredits Burling through the dramatic irony, and he uses Burling to discredit the ruling classes. So Burling says there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble in the near future. The audience know of the general strike of 1926 and the strikes that continued into the 1930s. Well, the thing that you might not have been taught is that there were a huge number of strikes in 1912. And what stopped those strikes spreading then? Well, it was that the country went to war, and all those workers who would have gone on strike enlisted in the army instead. So you can see how the war led to more profit that way. The workers who would have demanded more wages stopped demanding those and stopped striking. But he also speaks of himself as a hard-headed businessman, and Priestley does this in order to show his greed, but he's also echoing the words of the most famous Prime Minister at the time. And that was Sir Stanley Baldwin, who had been Prime Minister 3 times between the 2 World Wars. So, you know, if you're in the audience in 1945, this was the most famous Prime Minister we'd ever had. And he'd accused hard-faced men who had done well out of the war. So Priestley is making a direct link between capitalism and the idea to profit from war. And he's suggesting that war is a necessary part of capitalism. So he's implying going to war in 1914 was a capitalist tactic to stop the strikes. So when he says this, and we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity, most readers see that as another bit of dramatic irony, because we're going to get the war and then we're going to get the Great Depression. But actually Priestley isn't using dramatic irony entirely there, because for the businessman, which after all is who Burling is referring to, we employers, it's absolutely true. With war came increased prosperity. Because who is going to run the factories making all the planes and the ammunition? Who is going to clothe the 6 million soldiers or the 10 million soldiers who fought the wars? Well, it's going to be the Burlings and the Crofts. They are going to make a fortune just equipping the armies to fight this war. War is a really great business idea. Now, of course, for war to be fought simply to increase profits would be intolerable. Therefore, the upper classes have to be able to deceive themselves. They don't want to portray themselves as people who are glorifying war, exploiting women, and being cruel and evil. They simply wouldn't be able to live with themselves that way. So self-deception is absolutely crucial. If you're rich, you have to be able to deceive yourself that you deserve to be rich. Now, this is called sophistry, when you come up with really good arguments, which you know underneath it are false, but they are argued so logically that you can defend a point of view that you don't really agree with. We see this dramatised with the hoax of the inspector, because Gerald comes in and then says, "How do we know it's the same girl?" This is entirely self-deception. So if we look at the very things that Gerald himself pointed out when he was describing the affair, he says she'd lost both parents, she came originally from somewhere outside Brumley, she'd had a job in one of the works here, and she'd had to leave after a strike. She said something about the shop too. Her age exactly matches the timeline, and so does her appearance. They all describe her as pretty and brown-haired and fresh and lively. In other words, the evidence that Gerald gives that Daisy is Eva, and this is all the same girl that they've all met, is overwhelming. And yet he still pretends that because they all saw a different photograph, it might be a different girl. So now at this stage, Priestley has shown that Eric and Gerald are both full of self-deception and sophistry. So Eric, remember, has deceived himself that he's treated Eva fairly by giving her money, or actually he's kept loads of it for himself. And Gerald is giving himself this self-deception that actually it doesn't matter, this tragic fate of this one girl, it doesn't matter because it may not have been the same girl that they did things to. Okay, we now need some grades 7, 8 and 9 ideas about the younger generation. We've already explored how Eric is actually deceiving himself and probably won't have accepted responsibility even though he claims he has learnt the inspector's lesson. Another reason that the younger generation might not achieve power is, of course, the First World War. So Eric might have learnt the lesson, but then been killed in the First World War. It's quite a high probability because officers died in greater proportions than soldiers, and Eric, coming from the upper classes, would have been an officer. Gerald, on the other hand, would have been just too old to be forced to join up, and may well simply has run his father's business. And therefore he would have become part of the older generation, and as we see in the play, he agrees with the Burlings. So most readers expect that Sheila has learnt the most important lesson of the inspector, and most students will argue in their essays that she has. One of the reasons is the way she keeps echoing the inspector's words. No, because I remember what he said, how he looked and what he made me feel, fire and blood and anguish. It looks entirely as though she's learnt the lesson. But Priestley is making clear that despite her intentions, learning the lesson was not enough. Sheila, like all the young women of 1912, simply doesn't have enough power or influence to change society. So Priestley is clearly showing it doesn't matter whether Sheila learns this lesson, because she's a woman in 1912 in a patriarchal society. She cannot achieve power, and therefore she can't change society. So this is another way that it is a feminist play. But for an upper class woman like Sheila, the only way to have any kind of equality with her parents is actually through marriage. And Priestley hints that Sheila is going to be forced in the future to accept Gerald's offer, because that's the only kind of equality she's going to get. So when Gerald offers her the ring, her words are, "No, not yet. It's too soon. I must think." Now, the terrible probability here that Priestley leaves us with is that she will eventually come to the conclusion that she has to marry Gerald. And we've already seen how Priestley undermines Eric's claim to have learnt the lesson. The words "not really" about having stolen the money, but also something that you might not have considered. He learns these lessons while he's absolutely drunk, squiffy as Sheila puts it, and pissed as you would put it now. He is completely drunk when the inspector teaches the lesson, so perhaps it's no surprise that if he does survive World War I, he doesn't hang on to the inspector's teaching. Okay, let's now consider the idea of either suicide through disinfectant, and I'm banking on this being a new grade 7, 8, 9 idea for you. She drinks disinfectant, but the act of drinking the disinfectant will kill her, but it will kill her in a particular way. It will clean her, symbolically cleanse her, that's what a disinfectant does, from the inside out. So her method of death sends a signal to those who know her that she is unclean. Well, why? Well, she's unclean because Eric has raped her. You'll have to go to my guide. She is facing a terrible economic choice. So the inspector says to Eric, "Did she suggest that you ought to marry her when she was pregnant?" Eric says, "No, she didn't want me to marry her." Well, this clearly shows that Eric has decided he should marry her. He's offering her some sort of financial security that would lift her out of poverty. But she says no. Again, that's further proof that he's raped her. And this is, in a microcosm, Priestley's way of showing how the upper classes totally exploit the working classes, and how in the patriarchy, powerful men totally exploit women who are vulnerable, even though they think they're doing the honourable thing. Eric thinks he's being honourable by giving her money and then offering to marry her, but it can't undo what he's already done. He's already abused his power to such an extent that she's wanting to kill herself, to clean herself from the inside out, to get rid of the self-disgust she feels for accepting the situation she's in. Okay, let's consider another 7, 8 and 9 idea about how the play is actually an anti-war play rather than just an anti-capitalist play. So Berling said, aeroplanes that will be able to go anywhere, and look at the way the automobile's making headway, bigger and faster all the time, and then ships. These are all ways at the beginning how he's saying there's no need for war. But Priestley shows that that's utterly naive, because to the audience in 1945, these advances that Berling mentions in the plane and the engine speed of vehicles and the size of ships are exactly what made possible the exportation of war to the world in 2 world wars. So these things that were making the economy better, well, actually, they have made war an expert. It's what allowed Japan to sail across the Pacific to attack America. It's what allowed America to fight back and send troops to Europe and to Japan. So you can see all these economic and technological advances just made war worse and more inevitable. Therefore, the inspector's final words about a lesson taught in fire and blood and anguish are not about class conflict. They're all about war and this strong way of linking capitalism and business to the desire for ever greater wars spread across greater parts of the world. Priestley wants to show how this brand of capitalism inevitably leads to war. Now, what you might not know is just after this play, the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and Priestley complained about this. Huge number of people wrote into his radio show, and as a result, he founded the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament because he is an anti-war writer. And it's really easy to write an essay and forget to mention that. But it's really easy to use this quotation to show that it is an anti-war play, and this quotation as well, and get into the top grades because you're offering more than one interpretation. It's not just about capitalism. Okay, there's a whole heap of grade 8 and 9 symbolism about the characters' names which you might not have considered. So why does Eva choose to call herself Daisy and Renton? Well, a daisy is innocent, it's beautiful, but it's also uprooted. As soon as you appreciate its beauty and pick it, it's uprooted and then it starts to die. And this is an exact symbol of what the upper class men do to Daisy. They uproot her, they take her job away, they use her beauty for their own pleasure, their own sexual gratification, and that leads directly to her death. And we could also argue that Sheila contributes to this uprooting as well. Why does she choose Renton as a surname? Why doesn't she just keep it as Smith? Well, it symbolises how she is for rent. And this gives us another idea of her self-disgust. When she kills herself, she basically realises she's been selling her body for sex, even though she hasn't been a prostitute. That's really the deal, the bargain she's made with Gerald and the bargain she's made with Eric. And Priestley also does it to show how capitalists see women as simply for rent. They're not permanent parts of their lives. They're just there to meet a need. They buy their time, and then, like Gerald, as soon as that time's up, they get rid of them. Why is she called Eva Smith in the first place? Well, I think it's because it's very close to Eve, and we've already looked at the story of Genesis and how Priestley wants us to have that in mind, but he also therefore has Eva, as every woman. He wants her to represent every working class woman from whom we all come. Then we have Gerald. If you look at the etymology of Gerald, it's Germanic and it means the rule of the spear. So Gerald is automatically linked with violence and oppression. Eric similarly is linked to violence and oppression. His is a Norse name, but E comes from ever and always, and Ricker comes from ruler. So Priestley is pointing out that Eric, the one who rapes Eva and exploits her most, is actually typical of rulers and typical of what they've always been like. This is the Patriarchal Society, the capitalist society at work. And then Arthur is a name that's really just come from King Arthur, who is linked to Albion, this idea of England. So Arthur actually represents England. So in an ironic way, he represents everything that's wrong with England in his exploitation of the workers. But in a more profound way, Priestley is pointing out that this is what the ruling classes are like. They are like Arthur Burling. And this is why his play argues we should reject capitalism and embrace socialism. Sheila's name actually comes from Latin Saint Cecilia, and she's interesting in two symbolic ways because Cecilia was blind. Now what's interesting there is the way that Sheila is blind to the way she also exploits women in the patriarchy. So she gets Eva sacked simply for looking attractive. But because Eva was pretty, she says I couldn't be sorry for her. In other words, Sheila at the beginning of the play is totally blind to the consequences of her actions. And that's different from the Burling. Burling's not blind. He knows that she'll be poor and she won't be able to get another job, but he does it anyway. Sheila, in a way, is worse because she hasn't even considered what will happen to Eva once she gets sacked. Then we can turn to her mother, Sybil. So in Greek and Roman legend, there were 10 Sibyls, and they were female prophets at different holy sites. They were revered and looked up to as having divine knowledge of the gods. And this is so ironic to Priestley because he deliberately portrays her as having so little knowledge. So Sybil becomes more and more blind during the play. She's blind to the consequences of her actions, whereas Sheila begins to see because she understands the world as the inspector does. And then obviously we've talked about ghoul, meaning ghost, and the link to Christmas Carol. So whichever character you're dealing with, you will now be able to write about the symbolic reason behind the character's name. And that symbolic reason will give you alternative interpretations which give you the top grades. Right, now I don't know how much you know about quantum physics, so this bit is definitely grade 8 and 9, but it's the same plot as Avengers Endgame. I've just been to see it. Hope you really enjoyed it. It's pretty awesome, but it turns on exactly the same idea of quantum physics. So if you need to know more, go and watch the Avengers. So Schrodinger was a physicist, and he tried to explain quantum physics using this experiment with a cat. So this is the thought experiment. So it involves a cat locked in a steel box for 1 hour. In the cage is a phial of acid. There you go. Its trigger is an atomic particle. When it decays, it will trigger the phial to release the acid which will kill the cat. So this decay may happen within 1 hour or it may not. So because the cat's in the box, we don't know, because we haven't opened the box, whether the phial has decayed and whether the cat is alive or dead. But at the quantum level, the particle is both a particle and a wave. So if it's a particle, it will decay and the cat will die. But if it's a wave, it won't decay and the cat will live. Now, this is the bizarre thing about quantum physics, is it only becomes a wave or a particle or a wave, when it is observed. Until the moment it's observed, it's both a wave and a particle. So the cat is therefore alive because the particle is in fact a wave, but also dead because the wave is in fact a particle. So it's alive and dead at the same time, but neither state is absolute until someone opens the box and looks in. And that's the thought experiment that tries to explain quantum physics. Well, what the hell has that got to do with this play, Mr. Salles? Well, let me show you. You determine its state when you open the box and observe it. Only at that moment is the cat alive or dead, one or the other, and not both. Well, that has a very close parallel with Eva. She is both alive and dead when the inspector arrives and says that a girl has killed herself by drinking disinfectant, until the moment that the Burlings and Gerald fully observe Eva. So the inspector allows them to fully observe her life and their part in it. If they decide they caused her tragedy, she lives. If they decide they are blameless, she dies. So this is how you get the idea of her being in both the alive state and the dead state at the same time, and their perception, their observation, is what's going to decide one way or the other whether she's alive or dead. So the characters decide on their level of blame. Now, interestingly, this will take about 1 hour on the stage in real time, and that's how long Schrodinger proposed in his thought experiment. Now, that experiment was written in 1935, that thought experiment, and Priestley knew about it. He was fascinated, as I told you earlier, about time, and also quantum physics would have played into his reading. Now, let's make a parallel with God. So if God is like quantum physics, the problem of his cruelty disappears. So this is actually a fundamental problem of the play. Many people think, well, why would the inspector be happy for Eva to be killed off? Why would God be happy for Eva to be killed off? Surely that goes against the teaching of the play. But if God behaves like quantum physics, Eva is both alive and dead at the same moment, and only the Berling's viewpoint determines which state she remains in. So from the godlike perspective, this comes back to the free will of the characters. If they choose from their free will to accept responsibility, Eva lives. If they choose not to accept responsibility, Eva dies. Okay, another fascinating theme about the novel is the whole idea of the First World War. That's why Priestley sets it in 1912, so that his whole audience realises that the First World War is coming up. But if that's the case, why doesn't he talk about the First World War? Why does he talk about fire and blood and anguish instead of World War? You know, the audience would know what he was speaking of. Well, something really peculiar happened to the public consciousness. So the First World War was so horrific that it wasn't spoken about. So one of the first famous books about the First World War wasn't written until 4 years later in 1922 by T.E. Lawrence, but because the war was so unpopular to think about, only 8 copies were printed. Many more were printed later, but it was such an unpopular thing to publish in 1922 that he just couldn't find people to read it. And then an extraordinary thing happened. 10 and 11 years later, quite a load of novels got published. So here is a list of really famous ones that got published about the First World War. Over 60 books about the war were published in these 2 years. But after this, almost nothing. So it is as though the public consciousness got all this stuff out in a cathartic way. It was a catharsis. Look it up if you're interested to use this word in your essay. They got it out in the open and then they stopped talking about it. Probably the most famous one on all this list is Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That. And in it, he wrote about how he just wanted to get the war out of his system so he could forget about it. Once this had been settling in my mind and written down and published, it need never be thought about again. So the whole idea for a generation of people was to forget about the First World War. And Priestley knows that he can't talk about the horrors of the war too directly, because then people might metaphorically turn away. It's just too painful. But dressing it up as just an attack on capitalism makes the attack on war more subtle and more easy for his audience to accept. So if you've understood that, I know it's quite a complex idea, grade 8 is waiting for you. Right, we're going to finish with 2 bits of grade 8 and 9 context. So why on earth does Priestley choose the textile industry? Well, we've already decided that that's because it was populated by women, and this is a feminist text showing how women have been exploited, but there are other political reasons. So 3 textile enterprises qualified for membership of the world's 98 largest industrial companies in 1912. Now 2 of those were British. J&P Coats, the British sewing and thread producer, was valued at 300 million, which made it the 3rd largest firm in the world of any sort. That's extraordinary, isn't it? These companies also lived up to Berling's viewpoint about a man looking after himself and his family, because J&P Coats was a family firm. Now that's why Priestley calls Crofts Crofts. Crofts It's also a family firm, and it sounds so similar to Coates. He's making a direct link to a firm that his audience at the time would have known. But what happened to the textile industry after 1920? Well, it suffered a dramatic decline. And the audience would have known about that. Once the textile firms were in the top companies in the world, and then suddenly by the 1920s that place vanished. They lost loads and loads of money, and symbolically this is what's happened to Britain during the wars. Britain has become less and less economically successful. Now this is another way that Priestley argues that capitalism is not working, and it's another way that he argues that war is an attempt by capitalism to make more profit. So choosing the textile industry helps Priestley argue that the capitalists want war, and also that capitalism is a failed political system and a failed economic system. Well, Priestley doesn't bore us with these figures. Instead, he tries to show that capitalists are stupid, and that's why he gives Berling the speech about the Titanic being absolutely unthinkable. So a grade 7, 8 and 9 point is that the Titanic becomes a symbol for the British manufacturing industry. So not just for the stupidity of Berling and not just symbolising a tragedy, but also that it represents the British manufacturing industry, which seemed unsinkable in 1870, but had sunk by 1945. And here are some figures, astonishing figures, to prove it. So in 1870, the UK was by far the biggest manufacturing producer in the world. But you can see by 1913 how that has changed dramatically. And who are the people that have overtaken Britain in Europe? It's Germany. And that is an economic reason why we went to war. You know, if we're taking a socialist view about why capitalism would find war attractive, well, it's to destroy a competitor. Interesting, isn't it? I bet you've never thought of the war that way. The war is just an extension of capitalist business. So hopefully you're already at grades 7, 8 and 9 and you're ready to smash this exam. If any of those concepts went by too quickly and you'd like to know more, they're all explained brilliantly in my guide. Don't forget to let me know which cover you prefer. At the minute, that's the one that I've got going, but I'm not convinced it's the best. I've no idea. Do let me know. If you have managed to get to the end, gosh, you deserve a massive grade. Well done. Thank you for sticking through. And you're exactly the kind of student that I want to make my videos for. You make my life better. Give me some comments. Don't forget to subscribe if these are useful. Thank you very much. See you soon on my channel.